Imagine the world as like a complex puzzle where the pieces are constantly shifting. We're not just talking about the headlines here.
No, not at all.
We're talking about fundamental changes in how nations interact, how peace gets forged or doesn't, and, well, how global economics impact your daily life, your grocery bill, your job.
Yeah,
It's all connected.
it really is. It's an exciting, sometimes unsettling landscape, isn't it?
Definitely unsettling at times.
What we're witnessing is, I think, a profound recalibration of the global order.
Right.
These aren't just isolated events popping up.
Right.
The conflicts and the economic shift we see globally are deeply interconnected. Each one influences the other in, well, profound ways.
So today we're taking a deep dive into two major interconnected forces that are reshaping this global order. First, we'll explore the persistent search for a political path to peace in the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Which feels like it's been going on forever.
It really does. And second, we'll try to unravel the seismic shifts in global trade and alliances, particularly, under the shadow of U.S. tariff policies. These are definitely symptoms of a world in flux.
And our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack why the traditional tools, military force, economic pressure, why they're proving insufficient in these really complex scenarios.
Okay.
We'll examine how new global powers and sort of evolving strategies are charting different, sometimes surprisingly effective paths forward.
And you're going to encounter some genuinely counterintuitive facts today, like the surprising truth about who really pays for tariffs. Spoiler. Maybe not who you think.
Right.
And we'll delve into why a pragmatic compromise, even if it feels unsatisfying, might actually be the most moral path to ending immense human suffering.
It's a tough calculation.
It is. Our insights today are drawn from multiple illuminating articles, recent blog entries from July and August 2025, so it's a very timely snapshot of these critical global dynamics.
Very current.
So let's unpack this. Where should we start? Maybe with the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Makes sense. It's such a dominant issue.
Yeah. So by mid-2025, this war has tragically entered its fourth year. Still no clear end in sight. And it's just impossible to overstate the immense human and economic toll.
Absolutely. Ukraine's infrastructure is devastated. We're talking entire cities in ruins, millions of people displaced. The scale is just hard to comprehend.
And the ripple effect is huge, isn't it? It goes way beyond Ukraine's borders.
Oh, massively. It's severely disrupted global food and energy markets. Prices surged everywhere, impacting millions of lives in countries far, far removed from the actual fighting. And this conflict has also, reignited Cold War-era hostilities. It's fracturing the very international institutions that were designed to preserve peace in the first place.
What's striking to me is how the sort of traditional military and economic solutions seem to be hitting a wall here. Western governments have leaned really heavily on sanctions, right? Hoping to cripple Moscow's war machine.
That was the theory.
But that belief, well, it seems largely illusory, hasn't it?
It really has. I mean, the data clearly shows Russia's remarkable adaptability. Leading energy analysis, like from the International Energy Agency, indicates that Russia, far from being isolated, actually redirected over 80% of its crude oil exports.
80%, wow.
Yeah, mostly to non-Western nations like India and China. The G7 price cap, which was intended to limit Russia's oil revenue, well, it was largely circumvented.
How? How did they manage that?
Through what's been called a shadow fleet. Essentially, it's a network of older, often uninsured tankers operating outside Western oversight, and also through ruble-based trade agreements.
Clever, but with unintended consequences, I bet.
Exactly. This has inadvertently fueled an alternative financial architecture, especially across the BRICS plus countries, and that's actively reducing the long-standing dominance of the dollar and the euro in global trade.
That is a fundamental shift in global finance. And if you look back, historically, sanctions have always had kind of mixed results, right?
Very mixed. They were effective in apartheid South Africa, sure, but that was alongside strong domestic resistance.
Right.
But then you look at 1990s Iraq. Sanctions inflicted immense humanitarian devastation, but they didn't actually topple Saddam Hussein.
Okay.
Russia's just a different beast. It has a larger economy, significant sovereign wealth reserves, strategic partnerships. It's insulated it from that kind of collapse. So the oil lever just isn't the pressure point people thought it would be.
So the economic stick isn't working as planned. What about the military aid? Western nations have sent an unprecedented volume of arms to Ukraine.
Truly unprecedented. HIMARS, Javelin anti-tank weapons, those Turkish Bayraktar drones, Patriot air defense systems, and by 2025, even Western fighter jets are arriving.
Yet, despite all of that hardware,
The battlefield lines remain stubbornly stagnant. It's static.
it sounds truly grim, almost like World War I trench warfare, with these heavy casualties and territorial stalemates that just refuse to budge.
That's a very apt comparison.
Yeah.
And layered on top of that is the constant, terrifying escalation risk.
Yeah, the long-range missiles.
Exactly. Providing those long-range missile systems to Ukraine, while obviously enhancing their strike capabilities, carries this inherent risk of escalating the conflict into Russian territory. And that directly crosses red lines Moscow has repeatedly warned against.
You always worry about miscalculation.
History offers a stark reminder here. Major powers rarely tolerate direct threats near their frontiers without drastic responses. Think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
Right.
The U.S. responded very aggressively to perceived threats near its borders. That serves as a powerful historical parallel. The potential for catastrophic escalation is always present when those red lines get approached.
Okay, so if military and economic solutions aren't breaking the stalemate, what is the primary obstacle to a political resolution right now? Is it truly a zero-sum game for everyone involved?
It often feels that way, doesn't it? A profound barrier is just the rigidity, the inflexibility of the key actors involved.
Like Russia's demands.
It's exactly. From Russia's perspective, their demands, things like Ukraine's denazification, demilitarization, permanent neutrality, these reflect, well, both geopolitical paranoia and what the sources we looked at describe as a kind of imperial nostalgia.
Which is unacceptable to Ukraine.
Completely. These demands are widely seen as attempts to strip Ukraine of its sovereignty. That's politically unacceptable to Kiev and, frankly, morally indefensible to much of the world.
But then you have Ukraine's position, which is also pretty unyielding, right? Their desire for NATO membership, which they actually put in their constitution back in 2019.
Right. It serves as a powerful symbol of defiance for them. However, the sources also point out, somewhat critically, that it has also been a catalyst for destruction.
How so?
Well, despite over $100 billion in military and financial support from NATO countries since 2022, Ukraine remains outside the alliance and terribly vulnerable.
And the human cost just keeps mounting.
It's staggering. The UN's 2025 humanitarian report states over 400,000 Ukrainians have died or been wounded since the invasion began.
Yeah.
Just awful numbers.
And the U.S. position in all this?
Well, the United States maintains its support for Ukraine's sovereignty, which is clear. But the sources suggest it does so without fully addressing the broader structural causes of this conflict. Specifically, Russia's long-standing, deep-seated fear of encirclement.
And you're saying that these fears aren't just propaganda, they have a historical basis.
Oh, definitely. These fears are not fabricated. You look back, Napoleon's 1812 invasion, Hitler's 1941 Operation Barbarossa, Russia's vast geography, while a strength in some ways has consistently left it feeling exposed to existential threats.
Even recent events play into that.
Absolutely. Even the 2023 Wagner Group mutiny revealed just how rapidly instability can threaten the Russian heartland. These deep-seated insecurities, they're embedded in Russia's strategic culture. They won't simply be resolved by sanctions or, rhetoric about regime change.
So the takeaway here is,
I think the critical takeaway, for all sides really, is that the ceasefire-first approach has clearly failed. It hasn't worked. And NATO's strategy, which is often characterized somewhat harshly as fighting to the last Ukrainian, is deemed morally questionable by the sources we're looking at.
implying a need for a different approach.
Yes. It suggests a pressing need to pivot toward a more sustainable and, frankly, more humane solution, a political one.
Okay, so in this seemingly intractable deadlock, the sources highlight two potential mediators, India and China, which is interesting.
It is, and it's not about their alignment with either side necessarily. It's their independence from the Western-led geopolitical blocs that gives them unique credibility here.
Both nuclear powers, huge economy.
Exactly. Both nuclear powers, immense global economic weight, and crucially, both have kept open channels with Moscow and Kyiv throughout the war. They're talking to everyone.
And the sources emphasize this isn't about oil.
Right. They're quite clear that their potential role in mediation has nothing to do with oil trade.
Yeah.
Because focusing on oil, as we've discussed, is just pursuing that dead-end economic or military solution path again.
Got it. Let's look closer at India then. Under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India has really walked this tightrope of non-alignment, haven't they?
They really have. Very careful voting in the UN, generally avoiding direct condemnation of Russia while still providing humanitarian aid to Ukraine. It's a balancing act.
And this isn't entirely new for India, is it?
No, not at all. India has this historical legacy as a leader of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. That gives it significant moral capital, you could say, to mediate conflicts involving great power rivalry. Plus, their presidency of the G20 in 2023 was widely praised for exactly this, balancing interests and advocating for the global South.
Okay, and what about China? Strategically, they seem closer to Russia, but
They are closer, strategically. But China has repeatedly emphasized its interest in stability. Their 12-point peace plan, remember that from 2023, it called for respect for sovereignty, ending hostilities, negotiations.
it was a bit vague, though, wasn't it?
It was vague in parts, yes, but it clearly demonstrated Beijing's appetite for a diplomatic role. And we have seen their surprising effectiveness as a quiet facilitator before. Think about when they brokered those peace talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2023. That was unexpected.
That was a big deal. So putting this in a broader context, India and China together, they represent a pretty powerful counterweight to the US-EU-NATO bloc.
A significant counterweight. They can potentially offer Russia a face-saving off-ramp from the conflict. And simultaneously, they might be able to push Ukraine to consider alternatives to full NATO integration.
It really reflects this multipolar world we keep hearing about.
Absolutely. It shows that peace simply cannot be dictated from Washington or Brussels alone anymore. The dynamics have shifted.
Let's circle back to India for a moment, specifically its role and the economic pressures it faces. The war obviously sent huge economic shockwaves globally.
Immediate shockwaves. Food and energy prices went through the roof. Wheat prices skyrocketed across Africa. Oil surged. It endangered fragile economies everywhere, including India's.
And that's the key point, right? India's economic reality. We think of it as a huge economy, but per capita.
Exactly. While it's counted among the world's largest economies, India's per capita income places it firmly in the ranks of developing nations. For India, oil prices aren't just macroeconomic indicators on a chart.
No, it's survival.
It's a matter of national survival. It threatens inflation control, trade deficits, and could even spark political unrest. As a democracy, India has to respond to its citizens' needs, ensuring affordable energy, just like it protects its small farmers. It's a political necessity.
So when India buys discounted oil from Russia, the sources argue it's driven by that necessity.
Primarily, yes. It's framed as an economic necessity, not some grand geopolitical statement. And the sources argue, interestingly, that in doing so, India actually helps moderate global oil prices.
How?
By acting as a kind of pressure valve in the oil markets. It absorbs some supply, which indirectly benefits even Europe and North America by preventing even higher price spikes.
And the sources point out a certain hypocrisy.
They do. They address what they call Western hypocrisy, pointing out that many Western countries, especially in Europe, kept importing Russian energy for far longer and in much greater volumes than India ever did.
Right.
India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar had that pointed remark, "Europe buys more oil from Russia in one afternoon than India buys in a quarter."
Ouch.
Yeah. The argument basically is, if the objective is truly to economically isolate Russia, the burden should be shared more equitably, especially by those with more resources and less vulnerability than India.
So the calls for India to stop buying Russian oil, they overlook these huge human and economic costs.
Immense costs. Removing affordable oil could destabilize one of the world's largest democracies, and it would hurt its poorest citizens the most. And disrupting wheat supplies to African nations just inflicts suffering on vulnerable populations totally removed from the war itself.
So taking wheat from Africans, cheap oil from Indians, that's not peace.
The sources argue it's the opposite. It's seen not as a path to peace, but a recipe for global instability.
So India's real contribution should be diplomatic.
Ultimately, yes. India's greatest contribution to resolving the war will come from diplomacy, not energy boycotts or economic self-harm. Its strength lies in encouraging both sides, Russia and Ukraine, to move beyond the military stalemate and embrace a negotiated political settlement.
Because peace can't be won by punishing the global south.
Precisely. It must be pursued through global cooperation and, frankly, moral clarity, creating space for reasonable actors like India to build bridges.
Okay, so if a political solution is needed, what would a realistic framework actually look like? The sources suggest it has to be a negotiated compromise, right? Not total victory or economic strangulation.
Exactly. That's the core principle. And they propose some concrete components. First, Ukraine would need to seriously reconsider NATO membership.
And explore neutrality instead.
Yes, explore a neutral security posture. Something akin to Austria's status after World War II, militarily independent, aligned with neither East nor West.
The benefit being,
it directly alleviates Russia's primary security concern, the one they keep citing about NATO expansion.
but Ukraine needs security guarantees in return.
Absolutely. This would open pathways for alternative security guarantees, maybe from the UN, maybe a new regional architecture. And crucially, in return, Russia would have to formally recognize Ukraine's sovereignty, including eventually over Crimea, though the sources suggest that might be negotiable in a longer-term track.
Okay, what's the second component?
Second, a UN-mediated military disengagement. Think of phased, reciprocal withdrawal of Russian and Ukrainian troops from those front lines in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, monitored by international observers under a UN mandate. We have precedents for this working, like the UNIFIL peacekeeping force in Lebanon or the Dayton Accords in Bosnia. Demilitarization zones can help stabilize volatile regions.
And the third part? This sounds tricky.
It is. The third component involves referendums and federalization for those contested areas with large Russian-speaking populations. That's estimated around 17% of Ukraine's pre-war population.
So they'd vote on their future?
Under international supervision, yes. Vote on their future status. The model suggested is a federal structure, maybe like Switzerland or Canada.
Granting autonomy but keeping Ukraine intact.
Exactly. Granting cultural and linguistic autonomy while preserving Ukraine's overall territorial integrity. It's complex, but the sources point to the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland as a parallel.
Which balanced unionist and nationalist demands within one framework.
Right. It shows that such compromises, while incredibly difficult, aren't impossible. They have happened before.
Okay, but let's talk about the moral case here. Critics will immediately say, you're rewarding aggression. You can't make concessions.
And that's a valid concern on the surface.
Yeah.
It feels wrong. But the sources highlight what they call historical realism. Real lasting peace is rarely won through moral purity alone.
Examples.
Think about the 1973 Paris Peace Accords ending America's war in Vietnam. It definitely wasn't a clean democratic victory. Or the 1993 Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestinians provided partial recognition, didn't resolve everything, but laid groundwork. Diplomacy, even imperfect diplomacy, can create space for future progress.
Which brings us back to the humanitarian cost versus sticking rigidly to principles.
It does. The sources point out this profound moral contradiction, continuing the war under the banner of principles while sacrificing potentially millions more lives.
Yeah.
The World Bank data for 2025 is stark. Ukraine's GDP contracted over 40% since 2022. Over 10 million people fled their homes.
The cost is just immense and still growing.
So the conclusion drawn in the material is quite clear. If peace genuinely requires compromise, then the moral responsibility lies not in prolonging the fight for some idealized, perhaps unattainable, outcome.
But in pragmatically ending the suffering.
Exactly. Ending the immense human suffering now. It's a powerful, if challenging, perspective.
Okay, let's shift gears. Beyond the battlefields, these global forces are also dramatically reshaping the economic landscape. Let's talk trade, specifically President Trump's aggressive tariff policies.
Right, a major theme.
We're talking a proposed 35% tariff on Canadian goods starting August 1st, 2025, on top of existing hefty tariffs, 50% on steel and aluminum, 25% on cars. There's this popular belief about who pays for these.
Which the sources say is largely wrong.
Yeah, the surprising truth might really shift your perspective. Who actually pays?
Well, the big reveal here, according to the analysis, is that when you hear tariffs, you shouldn't picture foreign governments writing checks.
Yeah.
No. The real insight is it's essentially an invisible sales tax. It's levied directly on imported goods, paid initially by American importers.
Okay.
And then, almost inevitably, passed right on to American consumers. You, me. It fundamentally shifts how we should think about these policies.
So wait, it's not Beijing or Berlin footing the bill. It's coming out of my pocket when I buy something imported. Like, walk me through that. Say I buy a new smartphone that was made overseas.
That's precisely it. Research, solid research from places like the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, consistently confirms this. These costs are frequently passed right down the chain to consumers.
So higher prices.
Higher prices on imported goods, making everything from clothes and electronics to food more expensive for the average American household. And it's regressive.
Meaning it hurts lower income folks more.
Disproportionately, yes, because they spend a larger share of their income on these essential goods. Now, the tariff revenues do flow to the government, that's true, but how that money gets distributed often indirectly benefits Wealthier groups, maybe through corporate tax cuts, for instance, which ends up worsening income inequality.
Can you put a number on that?
Sure. To give you a concrete example, a 10% tariff on, say, $500 billion worth of imports could increase consumer prices by somewhere between $35 billion and $45 billion annually. That's a significant chunk directly impacting people's wallets.
That really puts a different spin on the whole making other countries pay rhetoric. Okay, so what about the impact on the overall U.S. economy? Growth, inflation. We saw GDP growth jump from a really sluggish 0.5% in Q1 2025 to like 3% in Q2. That looks good, right? A bounce back.
It might look good on the surface, yes.
Yeah.
But digging deeper, this kind of bounce back can often be temporary. It might be a cyclical recovery, maybe driven by a short burst of consumer spending or even inventory adjustments.
Like businesses stocking up before tariffs hit?
Exactly. Businesses might front-load imports ahead of expected tariffs, creating an artificial temporary boost. But true, sustainable long-term growth, that requires robust drivers like increased productivity, rising wages, not just these temporary surges from economic adjustments or policy reactions.
Okay, and what about inflation? That's the other big worry.
Right. Tariffs directly contribute to what economists call cost-push inflation. Basically, businesses face higher costs for the materials and goods they import.
And they push those costs onto us.
They're forced to pass those higher costs directly onto consumer prices. What's often overlooked, though, is the lag. The effects of tariffs take time to filter through the whole economy.
So it's not immediate.
Not always. If tariffs are imposed, say, in late 2025, you might not see inflation spike right away. But it could accelerate significantly in 2026, potentially pushing the consumer price index, the CPI, above 3%.
And the consequences of that sound pretty serious for the economy.
They are. A sustained rise in inflation like that could trigger the Federal Reserve to tighten monetary policy.
Meaning raise interest rates.
Typically, yes. Raising interest rates is designed to cool down economic growth. And over time, if these tariff-induced inflationary pressures persist, we could see overall economic growth slowing down quite a bit, maybe to as little as 1% to 1.5% by 2027.
And the wealth gap.
Widening further,
Yeah.
all while the wealth gap potentially widens, impacting the very households already hit hardest by the initial price increases from the tariffs themselves. It's a concerning cycle.
This is sounding less like a global trade war where everyone loses together and more like something else. The sources use this striking phrase, the Great American Chaos, and they talk about a WTO -1 world.
Yeah, those are powerful terms.
The conventional wisdom, maybe from the 1930s Smoot-Hawley experience, was that tariffs lead to retaliation and then this disastrous downward spiral for everyone. But the sources say that's not what's happening now.
That's one of the most surprising insights, I think. The world is largely not repeating that catastrophic spiral this time. Instead, other nations, even the ones directly targeted by U.S. tariffs, are mostly practicing strategic restraint. They're not retaliating in kind across the board.
Why not?
It seems to stem from an understanding, perhaps a hard-learned lesson, that trade, in the long run, actually builds resilience. It expands markets for their own goods, and ultimately, it reduces prices for their consumers. They see the bigger picture.
So instead of fighting fire with fire, they're building new alliances, new trade routes.
Precisely. They are embracing deeper integration amongst themselves, negotiating new free trade agreements, strengthening regional ties like ASEAN or the EU, weaving this dense mesh of economic cooperation that operates largely outside the U.S. sphere of influence.
Which leaves the U.S. looking like
An outlier. This strategic restraint by other countries is truly remarkable, and it makes America stand out, not as a leader shaping the new global order, but increasingly as an outlier. Think about it. A $19 trillion U.S. economy trying to strong-arm a world that collectively accounts for more than $90 trillion of GDP.
the math doesn't really add up for the U.S. there.
It doesn't seem sustainable. The world, according to these sources, is clearly no longer waiting for the U.S. to lead the way on trade. They're moving on.
Wow. So this Great American Chaos isn't a global depression then, but a uniquely American crisis unfolding mainly within U.S. borders. What does that chaos actually look like for people living here?
It seems to have several distinct features, according to the analysis. First, there's what the sources call price chaos. That's the direct hit, a sharp rise in consumer prices as tariffs disrupt supply chains and inflate the cost of imported goods. That's the impact on your wallet day to day.
Okay, what else?
Then you potentially get political chaos. As prices surge and public frustration mounts, a president's approval ratings in this case, President Trump's could plummet. maybe into the low 30s, a level that could alienate even staunch allies in Congress, making it harder to govern.
Makes sense. And the economic fallout continues.
Yes, leading to economic chaos. Widespread confusion among businesses trying to navigate disrupted supply chains, potential job losses in sectors heavily reliant on trade, both imports and exports, and a generally weakening investment climate because of the uncertainty.
And finally,
Trade chaos. As the U.S. pulls back from or actively undermines established global trade norms, like the WTO rules, its partners just forge ahead without it. This risks isolating the U.S. in the long-term structure of the global economy. They're building a system that might not have a central place for the U.S.
so that the world keeps spinning, economically speaking, just maybe without the U.S. acting as its central pillar anymore, which leads directly to this idea of a WTO -1 world.
It does. And you have to ask, what are the broader implications of that? This breakdown of the WTO, the U.S. retreating from multilateral trade norms, it's ushering in a whole new phase in globalization.
A different kind of globalization.
Yes, global trade continues, absolutely, but increasingly without the active participation or certainly the leadership of the United States. This signifies really the crumbling of that whole post-World War II multilateral system.
Bretton Woods, the UN, GATT.
Exactly. The Bretton Woods institutions, the UN, GATT, which became the WTO, that old architecture, the sources argue, simply cannot contain the complexity of 21st century challenges. Global trade, digital economies, climate change, development. It's just not built for it anymore.
So what's needed then? A complete overhaul, a Bretton Woods 2.0, as the sources suggest.
That's the proposal. The need for a Bretton Woods 2.0, a fundamentally new framework for global economic cooperation that actually reflects today's multipolar realities, not the world of 1945. And alongside that, maybe a reborn United Nations with a governance structure that reflects current population, economic size, and demands equal representation.
That sounds like a massive undertaking.
Huge. But what's perhaps optimistic in this view is the idea that the world doesn't necessarily need to wait for Washington to take the lead.
They can build it themselves.
If enough other countries step up, align their interests, and start building these new structures, the argument goes, the United States will eventually have to join. Not out of altruism, but out of sheer economic necessity, because the U.S. also needs a stable world to thrive.
So, counterintuitively, the great chaos inside the U.S. could actually be a catalyst for global renewal.
That's the provocative idea put forward, that internal U.S. struggles might force the rest of the world to build something new and better.
Let's zoom in on one specific relationship here. Canada's Strategic Balancing Act against these U.S. tariffs. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, who took office in March 2025, winning partly on an anti-Trump platform, Canada's been in a really tricky spot.
Extremely tricky. Canada's response has been this calculated, multi-pronged approach. Intense diplomatic negotiations, some very strategic concessions, but also clear preparations for retaliation if needed.
And the threats are serious. The potential 35% tariff on all Canadian goods, on top of the existing ones on steel, aluminum, cars.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how Carney, specifically, has managed this pressure cooker.
He's been pushing hard on negotiations, right? Trying to update trade and security agreements to head off these tariffs. There was that deadline he set.
Right. He initially set a July 21st deadline for a deal, which Trump then extended to August 1st after sending a letter. So the talks are ongoing, very high stakes. But the sources consistently highlight that while the negotiations have been, professional, Trump's sheer unpredictability makes them incredibly challenging. You never know what's coming next.
And Carney has made some concessions along the way.
Some notable ones, yes. For example, Canada scrapped a planned digital services tax, a tax aimed largely at big U.S. tech companies back in June 2025.
Why?
Because Trump threatened to halt the trade talks altogether if they went ahead with it. So it demonstrated a willingness to compromise, to keep the negotiations alive. Though naturally, some critics back in Canada argued it showed weakness, that he gave in too easily.
But it's not all concessions, is it? They have threatened retaliation, too.
Oh, yes. Simultaneously, Canada outlined a hefty $155 billion package of potential staged retaliatory tariffs. This included things like possible excise duties on key U.S. imports like oil, potash, other commodities, clearly signaling they were ready to defend Canadian workers and companies if necessary.
So a classic carrot-and-stick approach. What else are they doing?
They've also been very focused on trade diversification, actively prioritizing reducing their heavy reliance on the U.S. market by expanding trade with other partners. They even signed a significant arms deal with the EU, for example.
And boosting their own economy.
Right. accelerating domestic infrastructure projects like pipelines and nuclear plants to stimulate internal growth and reduce vulnerability to U.S. economic pressure.
But they haven't pulled the trigger on retaliation yet, even on things like steel.
Interestingly, no. Despite considerable pressure from Canadian industries, particularly steel and aluminum producers and some provincial premiers, Canada paused plans to double its existing retaliatory tariffs on U.S. steel and aluminum, from 25% up to 50%, after Trump agreed to extend that negotiation deadline to August 1st. They chose to keep talking for now.
How does Mark Carney's approach compare to his predecessor, Justin Trudeau? Trudeau's relationship with Trump was famously, well, frosty.
Frosty's a good word. Carney, perhaps drawing on his background as a former central banker, seems to have fostered a deliberately warmer, more collegial atmosphere with Trump. Trump apparently even called Carney a terrific guy at one point. It is. This more professional, maybe less confrontational tone seems to have helped maintain somewhat cordial negotiations, even amidst the tariff threats. While Trudeau's approach sometimes seemed to escalate tensions, Carney's adopted a more pragmatic style, making tactical concessions like scrapping that digital services tax to keep talks alive, even if it drew fire from political opponents like Pierre Poilievre, who accused him of conceding too much.
And Carney's outlook has shifted.
It seems so. Sources suggest he was initially quite optimistic about avoiding tariffs altogether, but more recently he's acknowledged the reality that perhaps no country is likely to secure a completely tariff-free deal with Trump. So the focus seems to be shifting towards managing the economic fallout, rather than full prevention.
That sounds like realism setting in. How has he coordinated all this within Canada, with the provincial premiers, with industries? That must be complex.
Incredibly complex. Canada's a federation. Carney actively convened emergency meetings with Canada's 13 provincial and territorial premiers, like a key one on July 21st. They tried hard to present a united Team Canada front. Ontario Premier Doug Ford used that exact phrase.
But were they really united?
Under the surface, divisions persisted, particularly on how aggressively to retaliate and also on some of those domestic infrastructure plans. Some premiers, like British Columbia's David Ige, were quite vocal in criticizing remarks by the U.S. ambassador, asserting Canadian sovereignty. Others, like Quebec's François Legault, expressed public skepticism about whether a deal was even possible. And Carney's plans to fast-track projects like oil pipelines face predictable opposition from indigenous groups and environmentalists. It's not a monolith.
And coordinating with the industry is actually effective.
He engaged extensively there, too, especially with sectors like the auto industry, which is hugely integrated with the U.S. and incredibly vulnerable to tariffs. Lots of consultations to assess impacts and plan responses. The steel and aluminum sectors, along with labor unions, were pushing hard for immediate, strong retaliation. But Carney clearly prioritized keeping the negotiations going.
Exploring pressure points, too.
Yes, like exploring those potential retaliatory tariffs on Canadian exports like oil and potash, leveraging Canada's role as a key supplier to the U.S., lots of meetings with business leaders across sectors. While he emphasizes dialogue and the need for long-term diversification away from the U.S. market, you can sense the frustration in some sectors about the delayed retaliation. It's a very tough balancing act, trying to protect Canadian interests while navigating Trump's highly unpredictable tactics.
Okay, so we've covered the conflict, the trade wars, but this global recalibration, it seems to run even deeper. We're actually seeing cracks emerge in Western unity in some unexpected areas, aren't we? Particularly as allies start asserting their autonomy on issues far beyond just trade tariffs.
That's a really important point. It's not just about economics.
Like their independent stances on Palestinian statehood, for example. That seems like a significant divergence from the U.S.
It is significant. It points to a deeper fracturing of traditional Western unity. You have Canada, France, and the UK all taking independent stances on recognizing Palestinian statehood, which diverges notably from the current U.S. position under Trump.
So Canada under Carney.
Right. Carney's government formally backed Palestinian statehood.
Yeah.
Trump immediately claimed this complicated the ongoing trade talks, trying to link the issues. Now, Canada has historically supported a two-state solution, so it's not entirely new policy, but making such a strong statement now marks a bolder divergence from U.S. policy, especially since Trump, alongside Israel, explicitly rejected Carney's comments.
And France and the UK are moving in a similar direction.
Yes. Both countries have also expressed support for Palestinian statehood. France has been advocating for it in UN discussions, and the UK, now under Labour's Keir Starmer, is emphasizing a pragmatic approach to Middle East peace that includes movement towards statehood.
So what does this symbolize? collectively.
Putting it in that broader context, these independent stances, they really symbolize this fracturing of Western unity we've been talking about. America's closest, longest-standing allies are asserting autonomy in foreign policy in a way we haven't seen for a while. And it clearly reflects a growing frustration with Trump's unilateralism, not just his tariff policies, but his broader rejection of multilateral frameworks like the WTO, climate agreements, and so on.
So, digging deeper, why are America's closest allies seemingly breaking away like this? It's probably not just one single factor, is it?
No, it looks like a confluence of factors pushing them in this direction.
Yeah.
First, as we just mentioned, Trump's pervasive unilateralism, his tariff threats, his open disregard for established WTO rules, his constant demands for trade rebalancing. It alienates allies who, by their nature and history, value multilateral cooperation and predictability.
Yeah.
Second, there's a growing policy divergence on key issues. Trump's rejection of Palestinian statehood, his withdrawal from climate agreements, his general skepticism towards global trade norms. These clash fundamentally with the often more progressive stances of many key allies. This prompts them to take independent actions to uphold their own values and interests.
And third, just basic economic self-interest.
Absolutely, you can't ignore that. The tariffs directly threaten allies' economies. It forces them to actively diversify their trade relationships, look at Canada's arms, deal with the EU again, and it forces them to prepare retaliatory measures simply to protect their own industries and workers back home.
So this breaking away, it's not necessarily hostile, but more like a pragmatic recalibration, hedging their bets.
Exactly. The sources frame it as allies hedging against U.S. unpredictability, while simultaneously, and perhaps increasingly, asserting their own sovereignty and national interests. Which leads us to think about the deeper symbolism of this break.
It really feels like it could signal the decline, maybe even the end, of unchallenged U.S. hegemony. Allies feeling empowered, or perhaps forced, to challenge Washington directly, that demonstrates a clear decline in U.S. global influence.
A decline certainly accelerated by Trump's more isolationist policies, yes.
And what's emerging instead?
What seems to be emerging, and these independent stances on Palestine and trade are prime examples, is a more genuinely multipolar world. A world where multiple powers, not just the U.S., are shaping global norms and events. This inherently reduces the previous dominance of the United States.
And the downside of that?
The potential downside is that this rift clearly undermines the cohesion of the post-World War II Western bloc. And a fractured West weakens collective responses to major global challenges, whether that's managing China's rise, dealing with instability in the Middle East, or tackling climate change. It makes coordinated action much harder.
Okay, let's shift back to the legal and political side of the tariffs now, specifically the unraveling of Trump's policies in the courts. In May 2025, the U.S. Court of International Trade, the CIT, made a pretty big splash, didn't they? They declared Trump's tariffs based on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, unlawful.
That was a very big deal, legally speaking.
What was the core argument?
The court basically said President Trump overstepped his authority. He invoked these emergency powers under IEPA for something, the trade deficit, which the court argued isn't the kind of unusual and extraordinary threat that IEPA was designed for. That law had historically been used for things like sanctions against hostile nations, not for imposing broad tariffs on almost all imports.
So a fundamental miscalculation in legal strategy.
That's how the sources portray it. A miscalculation that really exposes a gap between the administration's bold, sweeping rhetoric on trade and the actual legal constraints. It looked like overreach.
And the consequences were felt immediately in the economy, right? Even before the court ruling.
Oh, absolutely. The tariffs had already caused significant economic disruption by that point. Estimates cited in the sources point to around $34 billion in lost sales and increased costs just for U.S. companies, alongside considerable market volatility and uncertainty.
So, if the CIT's ruling is ultimately upheld on appeal?
If it's upheld, it would effectively nullify those specific IEPA-based tariffs. It would expose that part of the policy as a high-stakes gamble that didn't properly account for judicial checks and balances. Now, the administration immediately appealed and did secure a temporary stay from the Federal Circuit Court, allowing the tariffs to continue for now, which shows their determination to fight. But that initial CIT ruling undeniably damaged the policy's credibility. It made it appear impulsive and perhaps poorly vetted legally.
Could the whole effort end up being perceived as, well, the sources use the word farcical?
It certainly could be perceived that way by critics, yes, as a chaotic, perhaps poorly executed spectacle that caused disruption but ultimately failed to achieve its stated goals, at least through that legal avenue. However, there's nuance here. It's important to remember that some tariffs, like those imposed under Section 232 for steel and aluminum, citing national security, or Section 301 against China, citing unfair trade practices, remain legally unaffected by this specific IEPA ruling. They stand on different legal ground.
So Trump still has other tools.
Exactly. And the administration's quick appeal on the IEPA case, plus their talk of shifting towards alternative legal tools, shows a degree of adaptability, or at least defiance. And for President Trump's core base, this legal battle, this spectacle, might still resonate positively, framing it as him fighting against an entrenched establishment or activist judges, even if the policy itself alters in court.
Okay, so what's the timeline here? How long until we get a final decision from the courts on these IEPA tariffs? It sounds like it could drag on.
It definitely could. So the Federal Circuit granted that temporary stay back on May 29, 2025. That kept the tariffs in effect while the appeal proceeds. Oral arguments were scheduled for July 31st, 2025, so that process is actively underway right now as we speak.
And when might the Federal Circuit rule?
They could potentially rule by late 2025, or perhaps early 2026. But it likely wouldn't end there. If the administration loses that appeal at the Federal Circuit,
They can go to the Supreme Court.
they could certainly try to appeal to the Supreme Court. That would extend the timeline considerably, maybe by another 6 to 12 months. So a final definitive knockdown of these specific tariffs, if it happens, could potentially take until mid-2026 or even beyond. It's a lengthy judicial process.
What would a final defeat on this front do to Trump's signature policy issue? Tariffs have been so absolutely central to his economic nationalism, his political identity.
It raises a crucial question about the long-term impact, doesn't it? A permanent invalidation of these broad IEPA tariffs would undoubtedly be a significant blow. It would undermine his narrative of being a decisive leader taking bold action on trade.
How would it impact his actual ability to implement policy?
Well, the IEPA tariffs were among his broadest, affecting nearly all imports. Losing that tool would significantly narrow the scope of his trade agenda. It would compel reliance on those narrower, more targeted tools, like Section 232 or 301, which require more specific justifications, like proving a national security threat or specific unfair trade practices. That could slow down or limit his ability to impose new tariffs as quickly or as widely, diluting the policy's overall reach.
And the political fallout could go either way.
It seems plausible. For his dedicated base, as we said, court defeats might just be reframed as more evidence of a hostile deep state or judicial obstruction, reinforcing his narrative of being persecuted. However, for swing voters or business community already anxious about tariff-induced price hikes and instability, it might just look like incompetence or failed execution, which could erode his economic credibility.
And globally.
Globally, trading partners, who are already rattled by the sheer unpredictability of U.S. trade policy under Trump, might further question America's reliability as a partner. We've already seen criticism from countries like Canada and Germany questioning the legality of these tariffs. A court defeat would amplify those doubts.
But Trump could try to mitigate the damage, couldn't he?
He certainly could, and likely would. He might double down on the tariffs that are still legally standing under other statutes. He could push harder to negotiate new bilateral trade deals, like the preliminary agreements reportedly reached with Japan. And his team keeps claiming they have 3 or 4 other ways to impose tariffs, suggesting resilience and a determination to press on, even if those alternatives are generally slower and less flexible than the broad IEPA authority he tried to use.
So let's talk about the price chaos this creates in the meantime. How much disruption are we actually seeing, and how long might it last?
The disruption has already been significant, according to the data cited. Just look at the numbers. From January to April 2025, the average U.S. tariff rate reportedly surged from a historical norm of around 2.5% all the way up to 27%. That was the highest level in over a century.
27% average, wow.
Yeah. Now, it did drop back down to about 18.2% by July 2025 after some rollbacks and perhaps adjustments, but that initial spike was huge. It generated about $108 billion in tariff revenue for the government, but the analysis suggests the cost burden fell heavily on the U.S. side.
How so?
U.S. consumers bore about 49% of that cost increase.
Yeah.
U.S. businesses absorbed another 39%, and foreign exporters only picked up about 12%.
Right.
So prices for imported electronics, pharmaceuticals, general consumer products have noticeably risen. And beyond the direct costs, it creates this uncertainty tax. Businesses and consumers become hesitant because policy is so unpredictable, and that suppresses investment and spending.
And this volatility is likely to continue.
Yes. With the Federal Circuit stay keeping the IEPA tariffs in place for now, That price volatility could easily persist through late 2025 and into 2026. If the tariffs were somehow reinstated at their full initial strength, you'd see further price spikes, particularly for imported goods. Conversely, if the courts definitively strike down the tariffs by, say, mid-2026, you might see some price stabilization eventually, but the damage done to supply chains and eroded investor confidence would likely take quite some time to fully heal.
And the impact on growth.
Economic growth, which is already pretty slow at 1.1% annualized in the first half of 2025, might dip further, maybe down towards 0.75% in the second half, if this uncertainty continues to drag on investment and spending.
Will this ongoing legal battle, if Trump ultimately loses on IEPA, render him a lame duck president? Does it cripple his presidency?
That's a complex question. A lame duck president usually implies someone whose influence is significantly waning, often due to term limits, electoral defeat, or just a major loss of authority. While striking down a signature policy like the IEP tariffs would certainly hurt Trump's presidency, it wouldn't automatically make him a lame duck, especially relatively early in a potential second term.
How might it weaken him, though?
It could definitely weaken his presidency. It might embolden opponents, both Democrats and Republicans, like Senator Rand Paul, who are critical of executive overreach on trade. It could potentially prompt Congress to try and reclaim more trade authority, limiting his future leverage.
But he could remain influential.
Quite possibly. His strong control over the Republican Party, his intensely loyal base, and his proven ability to reframe setbacks as battles against judicial overreach or the deep state could sustain his political influence. Plus, his broader agenda on immigration, deregulation, maybe crypto, and his sheer political showmanship could keep him from falling into a full lame duck status, particularly if this happens relatively early in his term. It weakens him, but doesn't necessarily paralyze him.
What does this whole tariff saga, especially the legal missteps, tell us about the decision-making process inside the Trump White House this time around?
It seems to reveal a process marked by several key characteristics, according to the sources. Impulsiveness, perhaps. Legal overreach, certainly. And a strong reliance on loyalty, sometimes seemingly over deep expertise.
Impulsiveness how?
Well, the very use of IEPI, a law never before applied to impose such broad tariffs, suggests a rush to action, perhaps without thorough legal vetting or consideration of the likely judicial challenges. The fact that the CIT ruling against it was unanimous, including by a Trump-appointed judge, really underscores that potential misstep. His failure, noted in the sources, to really engage with the court's detailed legal reasoning in his public reactions also points to maybe a disregard for that kind of detailed analysis.
So very centralized, maybe top-down decision-making, and reactive.
It appears so. It reflects Trump's known preference for unilateral executive action, often bypassing Congress. The quick appeal after the CIT ruling and the immediate talk of exploring alternative statutes shows a reactive capacity, but also perhaps a tendency to deflect blame onto activist judges rather than reevaluating the initial strategy.
What about the people surrounding him? Who is advising him on this?
His inner circle, based on the reports, seems to be a blend. You have staunch loyalists, some committed ideologues, and some more pragmatic operators, although the emphasis seems heavily weighted towards loyalty.
Examples.
You see loyalists like Stephen Miller, who reportedly called the CIT ruling a judicial coup, or Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt decrying judicial overreach. They prioritize defending Trump's narrative above all else, amplifying his anti-establishment rhetoric. Then you have pragmatists, maybe like Kevin Hassett at the National Economic Council, who seem more focused on strategy, publicly dismissing the ruling as just a hiccup and pointing to alternative tariff tools. Or Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who focuses on implementation, even if his public timelines seem optimistic.
And we've seen some high-profile departures that seem linked to dissent.
Yes, that's relevant too. Elon Musk's reported exit from an advisory role after apparently clashing on policy, and the firing of Floyd Brown from the Kennedy Center, seemingly for ideological reasons. These incidents suggest that alignment and loyalty are valued very highly, perhaps sometimes over independent expertise or constructive disagreement. This kind of environment, leaning heavily on loyalty with potentially less emphasis on deep legal or policy nuance, might contribute to missteps like the overreach with the IEEP tariffs.
So putting it all together, what does this reveal about Trump's overall attitude towards governing, towards policymaking?
It seems to reflect a pretty consistent attitude we've seen before. Defiant, often dismissive of established processes and norms, and seemingly unyielding to external criticism or legal constraints.
How so?
His immediate appeals of court rulings, his public attacks on judges, labeling them as activist or part of a judicial tyranny, It all shows a refusal to accept setbacks quietly or concede error. His apparent failure to engage with the substance of the CIT's legal reasoning suggests a belief that his executive authority ought to supersede judicial checks.
And this fits a pattern.
It aligns with his history of stretching executive powers and challenging institutional norms. Even anecdotes, like reportedly threatening 100% tariffs on Mattel dolls over perceived personal grievance, underscore a potentially whimsical, personality-driven approach to major policy decisions. There also seems to be an unwillingness to listen to dissenting views, attacking former allies who criticize him, which can reinforce an echo chamber where challenges to his instincts are minimized or dismissed.
Wow. Okay, so we have really covered a lot of ground here. We've unpacked how these huge global forces, major conflicts like Russia, Ukraine, and these big trade shifts driven by U.S. tariff policies are just fundamentally intertwined.
Deeply intertwined.
They're actively reshaping our world order, creating all sorts of unexpected consequences, forcing completely new calculations from the stark humanitarian need for political solutions in Ukraine to the really surprising economic realities of who actually pays for tariffs.
Hint. It's usually domestic consumers and businesses.
Right. We've seen this clear, pressing need for fresh thinking, for maybe more pragmatic compromises, even when they feel difficult.
It really feels like the old frameworks, the old ways of doing things are struggling to cope with the sheer complexity of today's challenges. The world is definitely evolving, traditional alliances are visibly fracturing, and new global powers are, well, they're undeniably rising.
So that leads to our final thought for you, the listener. In this era that the sources call the Great American Chaos, in a WTO-1 world where old alliances are fraying and new powers are asserting themselves, what comes next? What new institutions or maybe what kind of new global leadership do you think is truly needed now? How do we bridge these growing divides and foster sustainable peace and prosperity, not just for some, but ideally for everyone?
And maybe consider this. How might this shifting global balance, this very chaos we've been discussing, how might it, perhaps counterintuitively, actually open up new, unexpected opportunities for cooperation and renewal on a global scale? Something to think about.